IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today we have something lined up in a realm that we don't very often dive into, and that is the history of India's food. That might seem like a little bit of a strange topic. I mean, unless you're a gourmand, then why should you care about food history? The answer to that is that just as food is a very important part of our lives, it's also been a very important part of our ancestors' lives as well. And the means by which they obtained prepared food can tell us a great deal about the systems of exchange that they were a part of, the kind of social structures they were a part of, the kind of access to resources they had, and really so much about the culture that they evolved in. Food is constantly changing along with human societies. The fact that we, for example, are so used to continental or European cuisine tells us that we live in a highly globalized world. If you ever eaten fusion cuisine, for example, the only reason why we're able to do that is because we have these enormous systems working away behind the scenes to ensure that these ingredients can move around. We have had decades, centuries of evolution and interaction that allow all these to happen. So as you can imagine, really understanding the history of the food we eat and why we eat it can tell us some pretty incredible things about the nature of history itself. I have with me today food blogger and writer Sujata Shukla. Sujata, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Anirudh. Thank you for having me on here.
It's our pleasure. Sujata is also the author of Bhog Naivedya, Temple Foods of the Gods, which is published by Rupa, which is a really interesting take on the mythology of various temples in India and the reasons through which they have developed the kind of food offerings that they have today. And it tells us really a lot about the history of all these many, many diverse locations where relationships between deities and devotees are kind of formulated throughout the subcontinent. But what we're going to be talking about today is something that is somewhat grander in scope and very, very deeply involved, right down to the very food that you might have on your table right now as you're listening to this podcast. Because did you know, for example, that potatoes and tomatoes are not something that are native to the Indian subcontinent? How exactly did they get there? What really were the systems that are involved in doing this? In order to understand that, we're going to have to go back about 500 years or so to a really extraordinary event in global history called the Columbian Exchange. Now, it's called the Columbian Exchange because of this individual called Christopher Columbus, who I'm sure a lot of us have heard of. And as we know, Christopher Columbus basically led this ravaging, looting expedition from Spain, took over Cuba, absolutely slaughtered the natives, and did a lot of pretty barbaric stuff, all things considered. But in the process, also helped integrate the Americas into the broader Afro-Eurasian world system of exchange that existed by the 16th century. And also in the 16th century, you see another group of people from Europe, namely the Portuguese, who are entering into India at roughly the same time. Vasco da Gama, for example, is a name that we're all familiar with. And what the Portuguese do very quickly is through control over strategic choke points, really at the entry points to the Indian Ocean, especially, for example, Socotra or various parts along the Indian coast, including, for example, Daman and Diu, Goa, and especially Kerala, as well as places in Southeast Asia, such as the Malacca Straits. The Portuguese essentially develop a stranglehold over Indian Ocean trade, which makes them absolutely and obscenely rich. They use this wealth to extend their colonial empire, to get involved in the arms trade with various parts of India. They get deeply involved in the politics, especially of Kerala. You see a number of smaller states, for example, Kodungalur, kind of allying with the Portuguese against the dominant power of the Samutari of Kozhikode. It's actually a bit of a funny story. When the Portuguese first arrived at Kozhikode, which at the time was one of the great emporia of the pepper trade, the Portuguese had brought beads of coral and so on as gifts, which were rather pathetic gifts considering the sheer amount of material wealth that could be found in the courts of the Indian Ocean world at the time. But very rapidly, the Portuguese kind of acclimatized to the Indian Ocean, and they began to import and export a whole bunch of stuff. We talked a little earlier about arms trade. They also got involved in the trade of horses, for example. And very, very interestingly, they also got involved in the trade of food. So what we're going to be doing over the course of the next half an hour or so is we're going to be trying to understand what exactly were these foods that the Portuguese brought in. How did this enormous kind of biotic interchange of species that were originated in the in the Americas, how did they acclimatize to India, and how were they received by Indians? How did they transform Indian ways of eating? How did they transform various societal interactions? There's really a lot to get into, so I'm super excited for this conversation. And let's begin, Sujata, by trying to understand what exactly was the Columbian exchange in terms of food. What were the species of plants that were being brought into India at the time?
Well, Anirudh, as you have pointed out, the Columbian exchange was really triggered off by the Portuguese as they extended their empire and influence over parts of Africa, Asia, South America. And Spain soon joined the party. The seaports became hubs for global exchange. Those must have been very exciting times. Author Lizzie Collingham tells us about the fascinating complexity of East Indian trade, diverse merchant communities who lived in and around the ports. You had Arabian, Fujian, Persian, Jewish, Armenian, Christian. An exchange of goods could mean, for example, that Malabar pepper was exchanged for cowrie shells in the Maldives. And those shells, in turn, were exchanged for purchasing rice in Burma and bringing it back to Malabar, which at that time had only a small rice harvest. Cowrie shells were an important trade currency in Africa and India in those days. Author Colin Taylor Sen, in A History of Food in India, explains that fruit, vegetables, nuts, and other plants were exchanged between Americas, Africa, the Philippines, and the Indian subcontinent, and Oceania. That is, Oceania is the lands of the Pacific Ocean, which included Australia. India specifically received a whole number of items, which you'll find in today's on your table today. Potatoes, chilies, tomato, papaya, okra, rajma, maize, sitafal or custard apple, guavas, groundnuts, lychee, sapota, passion fruit, sunflowers, cashew, squash, cocoa, pumpkin, so many different items. And these didn't come, all together at one particular point of time. Nor did they come always directly from the New World. They came at different points of time, sometimes from the New World, sometimes from the Far East, sometimes from Europe or Africa, or they were later on brought in by the British or Dutch, who encouraged their cultivation in India in later decades. The jury is still out as to whether maize, pineapple, sunflower, cashew, and custard apples were actually indigenous to India or were introduced through Indian and Mesoamerican contacts much before the arrival of the Europeans.
Indian and Mesoamerican contacts.
Those who are of the view that they came in, yes. Those who are of the view that they came in much earlier identify these vegetables and fruits among 11th to 13th century CE temple carvings in Karnataka.
Yeah.
While those who do not agree argue that these sculptures depict other produce.
I've actually seen some of these sculptures. You can see them in Hoysala temples. Like I think there's a few examples of this at Nugehalli, and actually visited that a while ago when I was like doing this course on Hoysala temples under Intact Bangalore, and it was. They don't look exactly like corn. They're a little different. The way that the leaves are depicted and all that is different. And like leaving aside the sculptural similarity, I mean, it is really difficult to say that, okay, this is depicted in sculpture, and to take that as evidence of like what is essentially a system of trade that spanned the Pacific Ocean and that somehow got corn in some kind of relay mechanism all across this vast area, and somehow didn't leave any trace in any other country except for India. It just beggars belief a little bit. So count me in as a skeptic on that front.
There is another angle to this, Anirudh, from what you are saying, because many of these items could have come across to India much earlier, but in really small quantities, not at a level at which they were cultivated and brought into the food. But it is definitely possible that some items did come earlier and they were utilized in a particular region of the country and therefore came as carvings. And for all, see, vegetables and fruits haven't remained the same over the centuries.
Right.
The corn we see today or the maize we see today could be far different from what it was earlier. In fact, the brinjal is supposed to have been derived from the prickly pear.
Correct. So that's actually why I'm so cynical about it, because when some people point to depictions of the Hoysala sculptures holding maize, for example, that doesn't look anything like maize in the 11th, 13th century. It looks like modern day maize,
Right.
which is one big reason why I'm doubtful about it. Now, certainly the range of trade networks in the medieval world is always surprising. You talk, for example, about how you have all these different ethnic groups who are living along the Indian Ocean rim, usually in these highly multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural communities. In fact, we've done episodes about these interactions in previous episodes of All Things Policy. And we also know that in some cases that there is some debatable evidence that native peoples living in Alaska, for example, were actually trading with the Afro-Eurasian mainland way before the Europeans even showed up. But even then, like, that is hardly evidence of the great urban centers of Mesoamerica being involved in this kind of trade. It's difficult to kind of imagine the mechanisms through which this sort of happened. But I mean, we're kind of getting distracted. Let's come back to the main topic at hand, which is the actual trade that we know did definitely happen in the 16th century. One thing that I'm curious about is, why was it that Europeans were importing all these food items to India? Why were they actually importing these food items at all? Were they more effective at providing nutrition than European crops, for example? Why did the Europeans have such a taste for them? And how did Indians react to them?
I think it was not so much a cause and the thought of nutrition as more to do with taste, perhaps. As the Europeans came across these new items and found they added to their food table, if I may call it, right? They started carrying these wherever they went. And as they conquered or took over more areas, they wanted the cultivations of these to develop. So that is possibly why potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies were brought in from one place to the other. That is what I think. What do you think, Anirudh?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point. Like, we do know that in some cases, these strange foreign fruits and vegetables were considered to be markers of status. So if, for example, you look at the Qutub Shahi tombs in Hyderabad, you will see that there are very often these motifs of pineapples. And that might seem strange. Why the hell are there pineapples in a freaking tomb? And the answer to that is that pineapples are not native to India. They had to be imported from the New World, and they're not easy to cultivate here. So to have pineapples depicted on gracing your mortal remains is to say that I was so rich in my day that I was able to import these things from so far away. Same logic applies to, for example, the obsession with Chinese porcelain, which happened in the Arab world in the 9th, 10th centuries, and also in Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries. To be able to import these very delicate, very artistic items from so far away, and to be able to drink tea from them, which again is an imported product, was a marker of considerable status. All that said, the story of the adoption of foods is I think it's a complicated thing. It's not necessarily just about one reason, right?
Yeah.
The fact that these new world crops could be much more adaptable, the fact that they could provide far more nutrition or provide far more value, more bang for the buck, as it were, in terms of the amount of time spent, were all very, very important factors as well. So, for example, we know that during the early modern period, that tobacco began to be grown in very, very large amounts in India. Tobacco, again, is not something that's native to India. And the way this happened was that, this is something that elites recognized had enormous value in exchange markets. And they would essentially use their power to push out these small landholders so they could build these massive plantations to grow them at enormous scales. So there's all these like economic kind of reactions also involved in all of these. frankly, I don't know enough about like food history to know precisely why these particular items were brought by the Europeans. But it is interesting to think that there's all these different factors that are happening. Taste is one reason, prestige is another reason, and just sheer adaptability and nutrition are also reasons. So all of these are kind of involved in these processes.
Right.
Okay, so this actually, I mean, you've pointed out that a lot of these crops that we really take for granted, like even maize, right? Leave aside potatoes and tomatoes, which are like so integral to Indian cuisine. And don't get me started on chilies. Like when I first learned that chilies aren't native to India, like I refuse to believe it. Like how the hell can you imagine Indian cuisine for chilies? So what really was this cuisine like before the arrival of the Europeans, before the Columbian exchange?
Well, there were lots and lots of food items available before the Europeans came in. No doubt today we love our potatoes and our tomatoes and our chilies and all the very delicious fruits that come in. But our ancestors were not deprived of good food. If you look at the southern part of the country, you have tamarind, which was of African origin, but we have known it in India since very early times. Katie Achaya refers to it as being here from prehistoric times, whatever that means.
Interesting.
It is an important ingredient. It gives sourness to the food. And apart from that, food had to be tasty, right, for people to imbibe it. So when you didn't have chilies and you had not even thought of them, sourness was an important item which came in. So you had raw mango, you had kokum, and of course tamarind. These brought in flavor into the food. Then you had turmeric, ginger. Ginger was another great flavor provider. Mustard, sesame, jaggery, palm sugar. Then you had a whole bunch of things like barley, ragi, jowar, bajra, wheat, including emmer wheat, which is one of the oldest wheats we know, rice. Rice may have been cultivated late, but it was known in India. Then sugarcane, which has been known since very early times. Then you have jaggery, good. Sugarcane juice, kandasari, which is raw sugar crystals. All these were the sweeteners. You had a whole bunch of vegetables, cereals, and grains, some of which originated in the Middle East or China or Africa, but came into India at an early point of time. You have pulses, urad, moong, and masoor are known for a long time. Tuvar came in a little later, then horse gram. Then you have the small dark brown Bengal gram, which has been there for ages. That's called the Kali chana. The Kabuli chana or chickpea has been a rather late entrant. It came in only in about the 18th century.
Interesting.
Vegetables, you had broad beans, cluster beans, lobia beans. French beans were not there earlier. They came in only during the colonial times. Gourds were there in plenty. You have bitter gourds and tendli and ridge gourd and pointed gourd, which is parwal. You have tubers like arbi, colocasia. Then you have yams, several types of yams. You had taro. Katie Achaya says that the sweet potato is of South American origin, and it is believed to have spread to the Polynesian islands and then to India in the 1st century CE rather than during the Columbian exchange.
Interesting.
So you have amaranthus, which gave you both leaves and greens. There is not much record of greens because they were perishable, obviously, and they have not been noted. But there must have been a host of Indian greens that were available, various types of saag, which we had at an early date. Then you have the lotus root, water chestnut, mahua fruit and flowers, the Indian gooseberry, karunda. These two were used for pickling and as souring agents too. Then garlic and onion. Both of these are African in origin, but they have been here for a long time. Coconut, which is believed to have initially floated over the waters and reaching the Indian coastal regions.
Right.
And then came in larger quantities and began to be cultivated. Safflower, from which oil was extracted. That is mentioned in the Arthashastra in 300 BC. Brinjal, which has been known since very early times. Citruses, there is some confusion about the citruses, but it seems fairly clear that the santra, the lemon and giant citron were found in the northeastern and eastern India where they were cultivated. Mosambi, there are two schools of thought. One, that it was grown in the northeastern regions, and the other that it has come in from Mozambique, and that is why the name. But KTHA says it is indigenous to India, and I would rather go by what he says because he has done real concrete research on food items. Then you have the Beetle or palm wine, which is mentioned in Buddhist Jain literature around 400 BCE, and it's possibly of Southeast Asian origin. Pipali and long pepper was exported along with pepper and has been known as an Indian spice for a long time, believed to be indigenous to India. Cardamom and cumin, both mentioned by Kautilya. Then cardamom is believed to be of native Indian origin. Cumin is said to have come from the Mediterranean region. You also have fenugreek, clove, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, asafoetida. We do still import a lot of our asafoetida from Afghanistan, but it has been known since very early times in India, though not extensively grown here. Saffron was available for culinary use even in pre-Columbian times. Fruits, we had a lot of fruits. We had bale, we had bear, we had jackfruit, purple jamun, bananas, pomegranates, which originated in Persia but entered India soon. Melons such as watermelon, said to be of Indian African origin, grapes, some kinds of pears, not the soft green pear which you see today, but another harder version called the sand pear, which came in from China or Japan. And of course, the king of fruits, mango. Personally, I think that the mango compensates more for, compensates for not having lychee and sapota and pineapple and goa. Though I've seen from a recent post of yours that you're not very fond of mangoes. You even go and call them icky and sticky, which I'm very sad to hear about.
Okay,
so you can say there are a whole lot of items which our ancestors had to feed on.
This is really fascinating, and I have a whole bunch of follow-up questions and comments about all this. But before we get to them, let's head to a short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On a show about crypto, Rohan Joshi talks to blockchain lawyer Varun Sethi, who busts myths about the illegality of crypto in India. On our new show, The Longest Constitution, hosted by Priya Mirza, we look at what it actually has to say about things we come across in our daily lives. In our first episode, we touch upon adultery laws and why they treat men and women differently. Bollywood's ace producer Madhu Mantana opens up to Sid about Indian cinema's biggest project Ramayan on Candid Kanan. On Agla Station Adulthood, Siddharth Sangai talked about the state of organic farming in India. And on Getting Meta, a chat with Pallavi from HRX on fitness and battling depression. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. That's really helpful for us. And finally, we'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Siet Cred, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and CoinSwitch Kuber. We really do appreciate the support.
And we're back. So before the commercial break, we were talking about the various varieties of foods that Indians had access to even before the arrival of the Europeans. And it's actually pretty astonishing, the kind of list that Sujata reeled off. Generally, there's a tendency to think of pre-modern India as this kind of isolated place that saw itself as very superior and was very obsessed with ritual purity and so on and so forth. But the reality of it is totally different. Sujata talked about a lot of foods that were originally from Afghanistan or Africa, for example, and were still actually eaten in fairly large quantities in India, and especially if evidence of them has survived in literature, given that literature was very often produced in very elite contexts, it means that elites were certainly being exposed to foods from a very wide geographical expanse. And this applies to everything from onions to spices, especially saffron. We know that saffron was actually very much sought after in medieval Karnataka, for example. We have these really beautiful verses written by Kashmiri poets who are in the service of various Deccan rulers in the medieval period, where they feel sad that they don't have saffron in as wide quantities as they used to, and they miss the saffron-filled fields of Kashmir, and really beautiful verses on those lines. So thank you for all that. So that's really interesting, and the sheer diversity of all these food items that pre-modern Indians had access to is very interesting to me, especially because they're part of these much larger systems of exchange, right? luxury goods are moving across this vast Indian Ocean world. Everything from Chinese porcelain to even automatons that were being developed in the Arab world were actually being exchanged across this vast landmass. And you had these very, very complex structures of taxation, of trade, of credit provision. We have these beautiful caches of letters that have actually survived to this day, written by Jews who lived in Egypt. They're called the Cairo Ganesha documents, and they reveal such beautiful little stories of like human connection. We have examples of one guy writing to his brother-in-law saying that, oh, if you happen to be in India and you're shipwrecked, then you can talk to this Indian friend of mine. He's the most trustworthy man I've ever met. One of the most moving letters to me that I've come across is this man who's writing to his wife and saying that he doesn't know when he's going to be able to come back, and he understands if she wants a divorce, and promises her that like he's missed her so much that he can't sleep. And even though he's become an alcoholic because of how much he misses her, he's never gone to establishments of ill repute, if I can say that diplomatically. So it's very interesting, and it's interesting also to hear about all these foods that are also in circulation, right? Because yes, these of course are people, and they of course have their own appetites, and they are going to keep importing and exporting things that they enjoy eating. And of course, these are just fruits and vegetables, right? We also have these really extraordinary preparations of meats that were being made, especially in Indian courts. We have this remarkable text called the Manasollasa, which was composed in the 12th century, I think, in medieval Karnataka. And the Manasollasa describes these absolutely mouth-watering preparations that we might recognize as pork pepper fry, that kind of thing. So it's a really fascinating word. So thank you for giving us a glimpse at that. But coming back to the Columbian exchange, right? So let's talk a little more about how exactly people reacted to these strange things that are being brought in. Like, I understand why Europeans would do it. But how did Indians react to it? What do they make of these strange, spicy, red pointy thingies, for example, or these muddy-looking brown things that grow underground, or these nice, fleshy red things that can be chopped up? How do they really react to all these?
It's really surprising to me sometimes how the potato became so popular. Because if you look at it, like you said, it's just a muddy thing which grows underground, nothing much to look at, and a little hard to slice. You have to cook it first. You need to peel it and cook it. It's not something it's very unprepossessing, right? But the thing is that once it is cooked, it is used. Okay, let me not even say once it is cooked. The thing is that it is extremely versatile, and somehow our ancestors seem to have picked up the versatility of the potato. That you could boil it, mash it, fry it, steam it, do a whole bunch of things with it. And that perhaps it added value in terms of, quantities of potato could be added to more expensive items, I'm guessing here. But it seems one logical reason why the potato would be so popular, because it could be added to almost anything, whether meat or other vegetables, or had on its own.
That's a very interesting point, the fact that versatility of a food also determines how widely it's adopted, right? Because it can make for humble meals, but also for the most luxurious meals. I remember hearing the story, I don't know if it's an urban legend or like what, that the reason why in Kolkata, you usually get meat biryani with potatoes in it is that when the last Nawab of Awadh was in exile, his cooks were constantly in search of means to enrich the food that they were serving him, and therefore kind of struck upon the idea of putting potatoes in because it added a lot of like volume to the biryanis. I don't know if that's true. So what do you think of it?
Another version to that I have heard to the same story is that it was not for the Nawab, but it was actually because a number of people in the court had to be fed. A lot of people had to be fed. So it was, it became very economical to be able to use the potato, so they added it to biryani. Whereas a Nawab might still have stuck to his original non-potato biryani version.
Yeah, I mean, I also hear that it was during this exile that they also invented this gulati kebab, this very finely mashed meat kebab, because apparently the Nawab couldn't choose. I mean, we really have to thank the Nawab of Awadh. The guy has impacted so many things with his infirmity and his
brought in a lot of delicious food into our lives.
Exactly. And this point about how you have these cooks who are actually competing to kind of like make these new dishes is very important, right? Because we know, for example, that poets in medieval courts would kind of go out of their way to make these extraordinary literary productions to kind of gain patronage. But it seems that cooks and chefs were also doing the same thing, because being able to make the most refined dishes with the most exotic ingredients also seems to have like sparked a considerable innovation in the culinary domain. So that could have been another vector by which a lot of these foods kind of entered Indian circulation, especially because in the initial decades, they when they were not yet being cultivated at wide scales in India, they would still have been like fairly expensive and not difficult to, and very difficult to get your hands on unless you had that much disposable income. But what about other crops? We've talked about potatoes. What about tomatoes, chilies?
The first tomatoes which came into India, Veer Sanghvi says that they were, not something which we would really relish eating. They were long, elongated, shaped somewhat like brinjals. And even today, in some parts of the country, they're called vilaiti began, which is foreign brinjal. They were extremely sour. So Indians started using them as a condiment or a fresh spice. The Europeans, after cultivating them, began to use them in salads. It added more flavor to their rather bland salads at that time, because they didn't have a whole range of vegetables to make salads with. But the Indians started using them as spice because Indians are used to spice. So we take everything which is mashable or puttable, take it as spice. So we took it to add sourness to the food. Even today, you have some rasams which are made of tomato, which are very, very tasty. But cultivation changed the taste and made the fruit less sour. So then color began to be something of interest. So tomatoes added color to the food. So they added color, they added flavor, they added a touch of sourness. So they also began to be added to gravies. That was one of the first major, apart from being used as a condiment, we started using them as gravies. So again, that became a base for putting in anything you wanted, whether it was your potato or your brinjal or your paneer or your drumstick, anything you wanted, you made an onion tomato gravy and you started bunging vegetables or meat into it.
This is so interesting. I mean, I firmly believe that I have the taste of a medieval Indian person, which is why, and probably a medieval Indian ascetic, which is the real reason why I don't like mangoes, though Sujata might think otherwise. Okay.
There's a little bit of the Buddhist in you, I think.
Yes. And I also do not like tomatoes very much. And that is obviously because I expect them to be sour and not to be sweet and mucky and fleshy the way they are.
Today we get a lot of firm, ripe tomatoes, and they are quite sweet, really.
Exactly, and the fact that this is a result of cultivation, and that they weren't always like this. The fact that they changed to accommodate tastes across the world is again a very interesting point, right? Because the current foods are constantly in evolution. It's not just foods, but also the ingredients of foods that are constantly in evolution, and they're constantly being pushed and pulled by various factors, and their taste is constantly changing, their textures are constantly changing, and in response to that, cuisines are also changing. So it's so interesting that we're able to like see the building blocks in evolution, as it were.
So let's talk a bit about chilies. Anirudh, you mentioned medieval poets who sang in quotes eloquently about so many things. So there is a song of the composer Purandaradasa, that is, who lived between 1480 and 1564. He sang about the ripening chili and its taste, and he calls it the savior of the poor, enhancer of good food, fiery when bitten. So the chili was not really seen in literature or text or in writing of botanists until the mid-15th century CE. Right? So Purandaradasa's poem is one of the earlier documentations we have about the use of the chili, that we loved it even though it was fiery.
So here's the interesting thing.
And imagine biting right into it.
Purandaradasa is writing before the Portuguese have really entered into the Indian Ocean world in a major way. So clearly, even before European colonization began, there were already systems in place to kind of exchange these very rarefied and exciting foods across these trade networks, which is pretty mind-blowing, actually.
I would think that it's actually the cultivation of all this which started in after the Columbian exchange. It is not exactly that they came into India only at that point.
Yeah, that's agreed. So that's what I'm saying. So so it seems that like as soon as the Americas entered the Afro-Eurasian world system, that foods were already being kind of moved around depending on their taste. But wide-scale stuff really perhaps only began after colonization really got started. What other crops came in along with? What other crops began to be cultivated at scale with the Europeans, Sujata?
There's a whole, we talked about potatoes, we talked about tomatoes, we talked about chilies. By the mid 16th century, at least 3 species of chilies were known, 3 varieties of chili. And talking about chilies, I've always wondered why they are called peppers. See, I'm a food blogger, right? So when I write about chili, I have to write about any food actually. I have to think about the different audience. I have an international audience. Mine is a small blog, but there are people from all over. Indians understand when I say pepper. They know I'm talking about the black pepper.
Right.
But if I'm talking about capsicum, I have to say sweet pepper. If I'm talking about the chili, I have to say chili pepper. Otherwise, my American and Canadian friends don't understand what I'm talking about. So I used to wonder, why is a chili called the chili pepper? And Veer Sanghvi says that this is squarely because of Christopher Columbus. When he reached what he thought was India, but it actually was the Bahamas, he was searching for pepper. That was his major objective. And he saw that there was this, little red, hot thing which is being eaten with joy by the local populace. And he thought it was a kind of pepper, right? So he called it the chili pepper, and he took it back to Spain as a chili pepper. And that is why today we live with the chili pepper and not just the chili.
Man. So it's amazing how many horrible things have happened in history because of Columbus being a dumbass.
Why, even the potato. When it was first talked about in England, it was called batata, and batata is actually the sweet potato.
Okay.
So today in Maharashtra, you have the batata vada. Maharashtra and Gujarat, you have batata vada, which is actually potato and not sweet potato.
Interesting.
And the Portuguese brought chilies into India, and they, in a large scale, they had it cultivated. We're talking about cultivation. There are almost a lot of vegetables began to have large-scale cultivation with the Europeans. Radishes were cultivated in many places. Spices, of course. While spices were used in our day-to-day food and we were very familiar with them and we grew them sometimes even in our own backyards, the large-scale cultivation of spices and plantations came in because of the Europeans, because they saw an economical value, the huge prices with these spices fetched in the European markets.
Right.
So they cleared a whole lot of land and started cultivating, getting us to cultivate spices and plantations.
That's really interesting.
So Anirudh, there is one more important crop that we should talk about. We come to one of Kerala's favorite vegetables, which is a staple in its food. You will find it across communities in Kerala. This is the tapioca or kappa, cassava. Tapioca flour has been known even in 3000 BCE in South America. Right? And in India, it is believed to have come in around 1800, though it could have entered earlier from Africa. It is said that slaves from Africa took it from Brazil to Africa.
Interesting.
Okay, slaves took it from Brazil to Africa because it was, a food that was available to them and easy for them to process and eat. It happened that in the Travancore region between 1880 to 85, there was a devastating period of famine. And the then Travancore Raja, Vaishakam Tirunal, he was hunting for crops which he could use, which could be planted to protect against possible future famines. So he studied the tapioca and he began to facilitate its cultivation because it could be grown everywhere in every backyard. And also a big advantage, it could be kept underground until it was required. It didn't spoil easily. It was very bitter in taste, and the Raja, that is Keti Achaya, tells us, the Raja personally demonstrated how the bitterness could be leached out from the tuber before it was used. If we discuss the Kerala cuisine and look at the different dishes that are available there, you will see that tapioca plays a very noble role. It is a side dish to meat. It is had by itself. It is had as a vegetable. It is of universal use across Kerala cuisine, and we have Vaishakam Tirunal to thank for that.
That's so interesting, and there's so many other potential questions, like especially because you've you brought up the question of tapioca being this imported crop that comes in through the strangest of means to Kerala, and like becomes adopted as a result of these very kind of unique historical circumstances, and is now like one of the dominant features of Kerala cuisine, right? It's really crazy to think about. It brings up so many questions about how else was Kerala's cuisine shaped, and given the kind of society that pre-modern India had, and like frankly that India continues to have, where there's all these taboos in various castes about what is allowed to be eaten and so on and so forth. And there's also differences in terms of like who would have had access to what kinds of ingredients. I feel like there's a lot to be explored in terms of how particular sections of society responded to the Columbian exchange. But unfortunately, that's all that we have the time for today. We will absolutely get to this in a later episode if you come back, which I hope you will, Sujata.
Absolutely, Anirudh, because the cuisine of Kerala is extremely fascinating. I hope we get to discuss it sometime.
Yes, let's. So let's just kind of take a step back and try to understand the broad trends that Sujata has kind of like laid out for us today, right? The single biggest thing is that the Indian subcontinent, South Asia more broadly, has always had these deep connections to the wider world. You know, you have foods that are coming in from Oceania, you have foods that are coming in from Afghanistan, you have foods that are coming in from Africa, that even before the arrival of the Europeans are already part of this very rich, multicultural, multi-ethnic trading world of the Indian Ocean, where you have many different groups of people across these vast geographical expanses kind of trading with each other in small quantities, which at a kind of macro level end up to these really continent spanning exchange relays. Even before the arrival of the Europeans, you had, for example, chilies that were apparently known by poets like Purandaradasa. And the arrival of the Europeans changed up a whole bunch of things. It most importantly introduced cultivation of a number of these crops. And it also, as we know, profoundly impacted social and political systems, changed who was having access to what kinds of foods. And the reasons for these folks adopting these foods was also, again, very complicated, very multidimensional. Some are doing it for prestige, some are doing it just for experimentation, some are doing it for taste, some are doing it for aesthetic reasons, some are doing it because it provides a better alternative to the foods that they currently have. And as we promised in the beginning of this episode, talking about all these things hopefully has given you a deeper appreciation of what you have on your plates in front of you, and has helped you better understand how the food is very often this kind of living memory, this living marker of how deeply and profoundly our histories are all interconnected and how they continue to evolve and shape each other. On that note, it's been an absolute pleasure, Sujata. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's been great, Anirudh. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
My pleasure. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy. Hey, before you go, the Takshashila Institution offers a whole bunch of absolutely fascinating courses, including a graduate certificate in defense and foreign affairs and public policy, as well as technology policy and healthcare policy. I myself am an alumnus of the public policy program, and I used to work in the defense and foreign affairs program before doing my own thing now, which you've just been listening to. But I can attest to their high quality and the fact that you meet some really fascinating people, including my former colleagues at Takshashila and a whole bunch of really interesting folks from across professions. These are designed for working professionals. You can do all of them sitting at home, and you will get to learn some really interesting things and learn how to understand our world better, as hopefully this podcast has also done for you. On that note, thank you so much again, and we will see you next Friday.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST, or our website, takshashila.org.in.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Given the unprecedented times our nation is going through, where positive is now a dreaded word, Smile India gets you delightful news from across the country about people and places that continue to spread the much-needed hope and positive vibes. I am Shifa Maitra, and you can hear Smile India with me every Thursday on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Oh, and did I tell you Smile India is available in both English and Hindi?